How are you doing, mate? 欢迎收听 Excuse 英国腔。
Always being very tired in the afternoons and thinking, why on earth am I always so worn out by the end of the day? And what I worked it out to be eventually, this is a bit silly, is the size of lunches. So I'm used to just in very typical like English and American style, just grabbing a sandwich quickly and eating it whilst on the go, and just kind of wolfing that down and carrying on and just powering through with coffee. But all of my Chinese colleagues made quite a big deal. It's more like the French, really. Like lunch was an affair. Lunch was an event.
Ritualized.
It was ritual. Exactly. It was a thing to sit down and take time over.
Yeah.
And consequently, and I of course got stuck into it. I loved it. I really enjoyed having big lunches. But a big cooked meal in the middle of the day was just not what I was used to. It was not what I was ready for. And so consequently, it took me a while to get used to. It's such a funny little thing, but it was that which really struck me in early days of just like the event of lunch, which is quite nice. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. It did make me think of kind of the stereotypical French thing of like, no, you have your hour for lunch and you make sure you sit down and you actually have a good lunch.
Tom Griffiths has been a cross-cultural guru between the Western civilizations and China for many years. Having studied Mandarin and taken Chinese studies, he can be seen frequently sharing perspectives and giving advice on China's market, particularly in its fashion, luxury and travel sectors. Today, as almost every facet of our lives moves virtual, the line between the physical and virtual has begun to blur. I'm delighted today to have this chance to talk to Tom, a consultant with over 10 years of experience launching and growing brands in China, for his insights into China from both his practitioner and scholar viewpoint. How are you doing, Tom?
Hello, very well, thank you. And how are you?
It's all right here. Pleasant weather, occasional breeze. Not too bad.
Well, it's very nice and warm in London, actually. The last couple of days we've had 30 plus degrees, which is unheard of for this country, and blue skies, which is also pretty rare. Though that's being unfair. We usually get a couple of weeks of good summer weather, but I don't know. Whenever it hits the British complain about it. It's funny. They complain about it when it's raining. They complain about it when it's sunny. But currently we're in the complaining about it because it's too hot phase. But I'm loving it. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I like good weather, so I'm quite happy.
Lovely. The weather's always lovely if you are in a good mood. So, I think everybody's quite concerned, and I'm no exception. We all know that the UK is about to, it actually is already back to normal, meaning there's no more restriction on those, facial coverings or anything like that. What do you feel about it?
Oh God, I could go on forever about this. I'm concerned. I have to say I'm concerned. Like we've had a couple of days now of over 50,000 new cases a day. Thankfully, touch wood, the fatalities are still down very low. So thankfully not that many people are dying. It is concerning the way that graph looks, I have to say. It does look like it's coming up sharply. So hopefully those numbers don't go up into astronomical figures again, because that would be very sad. But it's interesting to see how they're handling it. It is a bit of a gamble. Yeah, it does feel like they're experimenting, and I'm not necessarily so comfortable with that idea of them experimenting with us. We'll see. On the whole, one thing that I do actually think is quite interesting. So here in London, I know that there are still a number of shops and places that are requiring masks. For instance, the tube, the underground here, the subway system, they are talking about maintaining mandatory mask wearing on the subways. So I think what the government's kind of doing, if I was going to venture into a little bit of kind of commentary here, talking head commentary, is that they seem to be trying to push responsibility away from themselves making decisions
Yeah.
back to the individual organizations and companies. And so that's the way it seems. So hopefully things are a bit more sensible. We'll see. It's all very well in summer, particularly because lots of UV light around. It
Yeah.
seems pretty good way. It's going to be a bit more concerning come winter time, but I don't know. Oh, we'll see.
Well, let's hope for the better future.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I've been in London for a year and a half now. I mean, we came back last time I was on a plane anywhere was coming back from China from last Chinese New Year,
Oh,
where I
wow.
went to go and see in-laws. So we were actually there during lockdown, during when it all actually not last year, the one before, sorry,
Mm.
golly, Chinese New Year before when the outbreak actually happened in Wuhan. So that was the last time I was on a plane. So it's been a very long time. I'm much more used to kind of traveling around a bit more, so it's been odd. It's been funny being stuck,
Yeah.
getting a little bit itchy. Yeah, wanting to
Yeah.
travel again.
Yeah, I think people, here and there all feel kind of stranded, and we really don't know when the borders could, reopen and when we feel comfortable. But, back to what I just mentioned about you, I really want you to pardon me for my sketchy introduction of your background.
No worries, no problem at all. Yeah, so I've had a funny old background, I have to say. I have, yeah, I've kind of fallen into what I do now. It was never kind of set out as my original career to end up like this. I never really set out with an original career.
Mm.
I just kind of fell into China marketing and China digital marketing and China kind of cross-border consulting.
Yeah.
Um, but so potted history of me then. I'll do a quick potted history just so you know. So I was born in the UK and grew up in New Zealand. So my parents emigrated to New Zealand when I was very young. In New Zealand, I learned Japanese at high school, and then when I went to university, I picked up Chinese.
Wow.
Um, it seemed a lot more relevant, being New Zealand is part of Asia, really.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
much more connected to that part of the world than say French or German would
Yeah,
have
that's
been.
right.
And so yeah, so I picked up Chinese, and did various scholarships and things, and spent time in Singapore,
Mm.
studying on exchange, and I went to China to Zhejiang Daxue in Hangzhou. So I
Right. Yeah.
studied there for a bit. And then potted around, didn't really know what I was going to do. Thought about being a diplomat for a while. So did various kind of diplomatic stuff, and then just kind of ended up. I was one of those terrible stories of not really having a direction, so just ended up spending far too long at university.
Mm.
And so I moved to the UK to do my master's and started a PhD as well. And so I did my master's in a there was a writer during the Ming Dynasty called Yang Shan. It was
Wow.
an interesting character,
Yeah,
who
it
was
is.
exiled. He was exiled during the Ming Dynasty for his part in this kind of rebellion thing, and so he got sent to the borders of Yunnan. So he's right down there by Burma in Yunnan, and so he became this really interesting character of living on the periphery of China at the
Mm.
time, the Ming Dynasty China at the time. And then, so I did that, and then I started a PhD in travel writing during the Ming Dynasty. So I was writing about the mountains in the Ming Dynasty and the representations of mountains in art and literature. I didn't finish it. The closer I got to being the closer I got to being an academic, the more I didn't want to be an academic. The more I got put off by the idea, and so actually I ended up yeah, just dropping that, moving down to London, and wound up in PR. And I wound up in PR, like public relations.
Yeah.
I simply I I remember it clearly. It's one of those funny stories. I wrote down a list of things that I wanted from a job. So it
Hmm.
was like a bullet point of 5 or 6. I lost the note actually. I should have kept it, but it was 5 or 6 bullet points of things like I wanted it to be international. I wanted to still do a little bit of writing and research.
Yeah.
I wanted this, that, and the other. And then I just applied for every job that I could find that filled those criteria.
Mm.
And I ended up in PR. And so I was in a PR firm doing mainly work with sub-Saharan African private equity investments. So really kind of, yeah, interesting. And so I think
Yeah.
I was there mainly to keep an eye on what Chinese investment was doing at the time. Because a lot of Chinese investment goes into sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I was working with mostly American firms, but they, of
Mm.
course, they didn't really know what the Chinese. It was still quite early on
Mm.
in Chinese in the Chinese Development Bank, and so I was there to kind of just keep an eye on that to let everyone know what Chinese capital was doing and what they were interested in and what the trends were in that
Yeah.
space. And from there, I eventually migrated my way over to a digital marketing agency and worked in digital marketing, and that was doing China in. So that was launching Western brands in China, and that's what I've spent the majority of my career on now is actually helping Western brands go into China
Mm.
and kind of explaining what they need to do and working with Chinese colleagues both in China and here in London, um, and in the US as well a little bit, helping helping explain that. So that's probably what we'll be talking about more during this chat than
Yeah.
the Ming Dynasty travel writing stuff. But but anyway, that's how I kind of that's how I wound up being where I am and doing what I do.
That's quite interesting because now, in retrospect, you were interested in China, and I think that's why today you are so knowledgeable about what Chinese government and its people are doing around the world. So can I just go back with you to those years when you were still in college? What did you know about China back then? I'm sure you studied in Asia before, but with your background from the UK, and also you studied in New Zealand, and what did you see from China?
Yeah, it's funny. So at college before I took up Chinese, I'd not actually been to China. I'd been to Malaysia and Southeast Asia quite a lot.
Right.
And that's partly because I have extended family here in the UK.
Mm,
And so what we'd do is we'd come back fairly regularly, and you have to have a stopover somewhere from New Zealand. It's such a long flight,
yeah.
and so it was always more agreeable stopping over in Asia than through the US, just because LAX isn't the nicest of airports to stop in. I have to say,
Mm.
I'm not a big fan of LAX, and so it was always nicer to stop in, in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore or somewhere like that. And so I'd spend quite a lot of time in Asia, and then at high school as well, I went on exchange to Japan, and so
Oh,
spent a little bit of time in Japan there, but hadn't
right.
spent any time in China. Um, and I guess I don't know when it came to kind of choosing subjects at university, China just seemed like an interesting challenge and something that was kind of the great unknown. It was a much larger country than I'd ever sort of dealt with living in
Yeah.
the UK and New Zealand, and just it seems like a sensible choice of a
Mm,
country that things were changing in it. Uh, like there was a lot going on. I
yeah.
wasn't I wasn't particularly keen on becoming an import export person or anything like that. However, that was seemingly what the kind of the career options were for a lot of people doing Chinese at the time. Um, but yeah, I ended up getting stuck into it. I had a fantastic lecturer at university who had gone to China quite early from New
Mm,
Zealand, and so had some amazing stories to tell of early days of living in China, like very early in Chinese opening up, and
wow.
it seemed, yeah, I think the
Quite
romance of
revealing.
it, yeah, yeah, exactly, the kind of the romance of the adventure of it kind of
Yeah.
got to me. Yeah, so that's kind of what started me out. originally.
Yeah.
I mean, since then, of course, I've stuck on and learned much more about the country and understand it much more as a modern country rather than this kind of romantic ideal of a of the the great adventure that China
Mm.
is. But it's yeah, but I still do love it dearly.
Yeah. And how did all that lead you to, where you are today, in cross-border consultancy, expertise? For example, you are quite knowledgeable about fashion, luxury, and travel sectors of China market.
Yeah, those are just niches that I've kind of fallen into. It's interesting. Those are simply the roles, the positions that companies. So doing China from, I'll formulate a better answer there. Doing China from the UK, I've always kind of worked in the size of companies that are interested in China, they're growing in China. They may have a small China team, but they don't have a large China operation.
Mm.
Because if they have a large China operation, then they'll have their own kind of internal consultants and things. And though occasionally I'll step in and help those larger companies kind of explain what their internal team are doing in China,
Yeah.
because sometimes that communication isn't very strong between the China team and the UK headquarters.
Mm.
But more often than not, that actually it was helping companies that are a little bit smaller launch into China. They've heard the opportunity of China and they're looking forward to kind of expanding out and seeing what they can do there, but
Yeah.
they don't necessarily have a lot of resources on the ground to be able to do that. And
Mm.
so in early days, I worked with the likes of Harrods, the department store, on their China tourism strategy. So that
Oh.
was before they had the ability to service in e-commerce, and now they've actually got stores in China themselves.
Mm.
But this was early days for them, so I helped them with their tourism strategy. I helped the likes of Mulberry, who are a handbag maker, um, with Farfetch, who are an online fashion company. When they first started in China, I helped
Yeah.
them launch their kind of social media presence. Yeah, so I mean, it's that niche is kind of. I'm not a particularly fashionable person. I don't think I didn't start out with this dream of working in the fashion industry, though. I know lots of people do, and that's fine. They're welcome to, but that's certainly not my background. I it was more because that was the company those were the that was the sector that needed the help. Those were the companies that actually needed the most support from what I could do and what I could
Mm.
offer. And so that's how I ended up working. It was kind of a series of fortunate events
Yeah.
that landed me there. Yeah.
What you said just intrigued me, because yeah, as a lot of people know, China is a huge country and its market ecosystem could be quite complicated for many people who never, lived there or never researched the country. So I would call it one of a kind. So as far as you're concerned, what is the current trade relationship between the UK and China? Because we know that the two countries are quite, in a good relationship and businesses are quite flourishing. Just can you update us on the current relationship?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the current relationship is fine. Um, Politically speaking, there's always various troubles
Mm.
that come up, and I try to keep out of the political side of things. Um,
Right.
uh, I think ultimately the UK is seen by like brand UK in China is generally pretty strong. Like UK businesses are okay. We're seen as mainly in the education sector as probably our strongest export, our strongest thing that we do.
Yeah.
Um, and then there are some kind of a few big labels that are pretty well known. But overall, I think the UK, generally, when it registers on Chinese consumers' radar, I think they generally think it's fine.
Mm.
I think trade-wise we're doing all right. I don't think there's anything too negative right now, which is good. Yeah, so overall it's all well and good.
Yeah, the pandemic also, has a role to play. Everybody is kind of disrupted. So,
I
yeah.
think, it'll be interesting to see after the pandemic finishes just what happens to tourism here.
Mm,
The UK has like we're not part of the Schengen visa zone, which is
mm,
the big visa zone in Europe.
yeah.
Um, and so in order for a tourist to come here, you can get one Schengen visa and visit, France and Amsterdam and
Yeah.
Paris and Germany. And there's a number of countries that you can hit with that one
Mm,
visa, or you have to have a separate visa to come here. And so
yeah.
that's always a little bit of a pull down. And they've now removed the tax back on shopping here. That's gone. So there's no kind of duty free claiming tax back, which
Mm,
they used to do. So that's also gone. So I think that might cause some trouble long term. We'll see. But that might cause some trouble for footfall in stores, like actually physically people coming here. However, for a lot of British businesses, China's is like an amazing market, and it's one that a lot have done very well in. Like a lot have seen pretty strong growth from that market and have done very
mm,
well. Um, However, like as you mentioned before, China is such a big market. It's such a diverse. Like whenever I speak to clients, I always say, look, it's the size of Europe. Um, like physically, it's about the same size, roughly, give or take a few thousand kilometers, but it's pretty close.
mm.
Population wise, similar. Like geographic differences. You've got everything from the you know Mount Everest right at the top and the Himalayan
Yeah.
plateau right down to to Sanya and Hainan and
Yeah.
tropical locations and then up north in Heilongjiang and the cold like it's very very different. So like geographically incredibly different and linguistically and culturally it's incredibly different. Like the diversity across China is enormous.
Mm,
So it's very hard to think of it as one market.
exactly.
However, that said, Shanghai is the size of Australia, so and Australia is a very good market for a lot of luxury clients, and so population-wise, Shanghai is a pretty nice target for
Mm,
some clients, for some of the smaller clients, and so yeah, like even there, that's a pretty good market to hit.
yeah. 让我们休息一下吧，访谈马上回来。Speaking of, differences, it's incredibly the case between the East and the West. So you as a consultant, could you tell us just some of the biggest understanding gap between the two at the moment? Because we know the two countries are in contact with each other. But when two populations try to understand each other, there are a lot of gaps to mind. What are they?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, one of the most interesting problems I come across quite regularly is the lack of understanding between the headquarters here and the local team there.
Hmm.
And so I'm just thinking this purely in a kind of execution company perspective, because of course there's lots of other things that we can look at, but let's look at like on a company basis. And so, big company here has headquarters, with the board and heads of various departments here in London or in Europe or in the US, and they have an execution team on the ground in China, and the two groups tend to not communicate all that well. And I've seen it over and over again in some really big successful companies and very small companies that you talk to the people here and they say, really love what we're like, I really would love to know more about what we're doing in China because it seems like we're doing really well. We see the occasional picture of some event that we've had, or we see the sales figures and everything's going really well in China, but we don't know what's going on in the ground. And we'd love to be more involved. And then you talk to the people on the ground in China in the local team, and they'll say something like, I mean, it's it's great to be working for this brand. This brand is really reputable. It's really nice to be part of this. However, the headquarters just don't understand China. And every time that they get involved, every time that we give them information about what's going on, they try to get involved too heavily and they ruin things. And so that does happen quite a lot. There's that issue of having a local team that doesn't necessarily trust the global team at being able to deliver in China, and then the global team that is concerned about what the brand looks like in China and whether like brand values are being respected in China. Which I can understand. I can understand from both sides. There is concern there, and so some things that will work in China might not necessarily work with a brand's global positioning. And so some things you would look at, everything from partnerships in the market right through to small executions on what an advert might look like or what a social media post might look like. It might be a little bit too tailored for the global audience, for the local market, and the brand would lose some of that identity.
That's quite tricky.
It's a funny one. It is a tricky one. So if you take a brand that has, I don't know, say quite a lot of heritage values here in the UK, try and put a hypothetical situation. So let's say they're manufactured in the countryside. They're all about the countryside. So it's all about kind of the Downton Abbey style, big aristocratic houses and beautiful old stone pubs and rolling country hills, very, very, very English, British, quintessential countryside.
Yeah.
And that's now becoming a bit more of a countryside, and nature is becoming a little bit more in vogue in China in the last few years. But 10 years ago, countryside was backward. It was poverty. It was the story of China was the urbanization of China, and everyone was moving away from the countryside. And so a brand that was going to be globally presenting itself as this kind of country idyll wouldn't necessarily resonate that well in China. And so then you'd have the local team saying, no, we can't do this. We have to be a little bit more of an urban brand. We have to be a little bit more edgy and a little bit more streetwear or what,
metropolitan, yeah.
Exactly. Whereas the global brand would, if you talk to the global brand director about that, or someone who's in charge of brand creative, and you show them something to sign off, so at a very basic level, an advert to sign off, they'll be horrified by that. They'll look, oh no, we're not an urban brand. We can't have graffiti on it. We can't have chains and studs on our bags or anything like that. Like it has to be a different identity, and so that can cause problems. That kind of difference. And so on the one hand, the local team knows what they need to do for a brand to be successful in China, whereas the global team is responsible for multiple markets, not just China, and doesn't want to change their identity for the Chinese market in any way. And so like it's an interesting problem. It's an interesting tightrope to walk because yes, brands do need to localize a little bit. They do need to change for the market. They can't just go in with their international presence and expect Chinese consumers to adapt and to find relevance in that. But they also do need to maintain that international identity. Because I mean, at the very basic level, Chinese consumers are the largest outbound tourism market in the world. The largest traveler traveling market in the world, I believe. They will most probably come across a brand in multiple markets, not just at home, especially on the luxury side. And so if your brand looks vastly different in China as opposed to out of China, then that's gonna cause a problem. That kind of brand, that it's gonna cause a bit of a strange experience for a consumer, and that's not good, because that's in some way kind of creating tokenism in the brand. And it's the very worst thing that you can do.
You can see opportunities and challenges really are like one coin, and if you are careless, you might end up in a place where you don't know what you're doing, especially when you mention centralized guidelines are not really abided by the local team in China, because they think they know best what happened in the China market. And it is true to some extent, but at the end of the day, to what extent should we find that harmony in is really the challenge, don't you think?
Well, exactly. It's the ongoing thing. So central brand lines are good guidelines, but they're certainly not hard and fast rules. But then also there's, so often where I find the most success in helping overcome these communication problems and these cultural differences is by simply explaining things more to the brand team here. So explaining more to the headquarters, explaining why things are being done this way, and explaining what it means, and just giving them a little bit more, not necessarily ownership over the process, but just a little bit more understanding of what's happening. And yeah, exactly. They're just a little bit more comfortable then. If they can kind of explain why, then that's fine. But quite often it's that. It's just like helping talk them through. Oh yeah, so this is happening because X, Y, and Z. And that, it helps. It does. It does. It's good. It also, like, as far as like the typical client manager in me as well comes out in that respect. And I always, years ago, I once had a boss tell me that try and leave every meeting by giving your client some like fun piece of information that they might want to tell someone over cocktails on a Friday night. So some kind of funny little story or some kind of anecdote or something. And of course, like, this sector is just full of that kind of thing. There's so many great, fun little stories that you can explain to people and have them later on regale friends, and like, in China, did you know that they don't wear green hats, or like something like that, which is because that's a funny story that goes back to the Tang Dynasty, and that, like, there's story to that, which it's good. It's like, it's a nice funny little thing that it's cool. It's good. So that part of my job I've always enjoyed. I've always had a lot of pleasure in.
You're really a storyteller between cultures.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's what the gig is, isn't it? It's telling the story so that everyone feels comfortable, basically, so that both sides feel comfortable about why the decisions are made, so they seem less arbitrary. Especially the decisions from headquarters do tend to come down as directives, and these directives can be quite. I can see why local teams tend not to consult the global headquarters quite regularly, because when these directives come down that seem completely at odds with what they need to do in order to be successful in the market in China, then I can completely understand why they tend to ignore them at times, because they're not explained in any way. They're saying, well, no, this is the way we do things, and that doesn't always work.
Right. So you just spoke of what happens between local team and HQ. Let's now talk about more face-to-face situations. For example, in the workplace, I bet you have experienced a lot of culture shock or cultural differences with colleagues from different cultures, mainly Chinese. can you just list some examples and how did you deal with that, or how did you instruct other fellow, let's say, European colleagues to deal with Chinese colleagues when it comes to confrontation or when it comes to just chat?
Sure. I have a couple of a fun one and a more serious one. So the fun one, I remember when I first joined a marketing agency, like a Chinese specialized marketing agency, and most of my colleagues were Chinese.
Mm.
We had another like British guy who was heading up the agency, but everyone sort of at my level at the agency were Chinese.
Yeah.
And that was quite fun. It was great experience, and it was really good for my Chinese. Basically,
Yeah.
it's good for my practicing. But I remember I joined from a traditional PR agency, and I remember that early on, always being very tired in the afternoons and thinking, why on earth am I always so worn out by the end of the day? And what I worked it out to be eventually, and this is a bit silly, is the size of lunches. Um, so I'm used to just in very typical like English and American style, just grabbing a sandwich quickly and eating it whilst on the go, and
Yeah.
just kind of wolfing that down and carrying on and just powering through with coffee. But all of my Chinese colleagues made quite a big deal. It's more like the French, really. Like lunch was an affair. Lunch was an event.
Ritualized.
It was ritual. Exactly. It was a thing to sit down and take time over. And
Yeah.
consequently, and I of course got stuck into it. I loved it. I really enjoyed having big lunches. But a big cooked meal in the middle of the day was just not what I was used to. It was not not what I was ready for, and so consequently, it took me a while to get used to. It's such a funny little thing, but it was that which really struck me in early days of just like the event of lunch, which is quite nice. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. But it did make me think of kind of the stereotypical French thing of like, no, you have your hour for lunch and you make sure you sit down and you actually have a good lunch. You don't just eat a sandwich on the go. Yeah, it was really nice actually. That was quite a big thing. So that was nice. And then in a slightly more serious manner, I remember one of my colleagues was particularly blunt, and like in the UK, we're we're not very direct. Um,
No.
Even in saying that, I like everything's couched. Everything's every saying, every phrase that every discussion that you have, you sort of you indirectly say things like
Yeah.
if someone, I mean, the classic example is, oh, it's not very good,
Mm.
means it's bad, really bad. But oh, it's just not very good. Like we're always very careful about how we word things, and we're overly polite. And to understand what British people are saying involves quite a lot of reading between the lines and quite a lot of kind of having to work it out. Whereas yeah, I did find that a couple of my colleagues were quite blunt when I first started working there, and so that was a bit of a surprise. And I do remember a few years in to my work there, like I had another colleague join,
Mm.
another Westerner, and I remember saying, oh, he was a bit put off at one stage by one particular senior person at the agency because he felt like, oh, I just can't get it right. I can't seem to get the job right. Every time I talk with her, I seem to be in trouble. I'm like,
Mm.
well, and I remember thinking that that's just kind of her way of dealing with people, and she's blunt, and it's quite refreshing.
Mm.
I remember finding it quite refreshing, especially growing up in New Zealand, where people are a little bit more blunt than
Right.
than British. Um, and so I remember having this conversation with him and talking about like, this is kind of a cultural difference here, and it's just yeah, accept it, but also like make the most of it. It's really useful to have honest, straightforward feedback sometimes,
Mm. Yeah.
especially in an industry that in comms, like in communications, people are pretty bad at it as well of not being very straightforward and always being very careful with what they say. And so it was quite, yeah, but it was interesting. It was an interesting problem.
It's interesting, and people really should know more about differences between cultures. So let's also talk about other aspects of China. For example, this pandemic has swept across the globe for over 1.5 years now. Can you tell us the status quo of luxury industry and fashion in China? Because at the end, we all have to shop, and lockdown cannot last forever. So tell us about that industry, at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, there was a Bain study early into lockdown that reckons 50% of the world's luxury spend will be in China by 2025. In China or from Chinese consumers. So
Right.
half the world's luxury spend. That's a really big number. I don't know if they're definitely going to hit that or not, but Bain are a pretty reputable. I think it was Bain or McKinsey, one of the big reputable outfits. So I mean, it's booming. Like luxury consumption in China is enormous. The growth of in-market consumption is, of course, been the big story. For a long time, Chinese consumers were fantastic consumers abroad. So tourists buying in Paris and London and in Hong Kong and Thailand. Like there was once, travel to shop is a big thing. Was a big thing. It'd be interesting to see if that continues after the pandemic, because there's been a big inbounding of shopping, and with the likes of Sanya and internal duty-free shopping places,
Right.
that's really shifting that spend, which is interesting. And so I'm pretty certain that Chinese consumers will still be tourists. They might not necessarily all go back to being tourists with the view of shopping abroad, but there might be more of a shift towards experience and wanting to travel to do other things, to go and to explore, to adventure. I mentioned before that, like, just very briefly mentioned before that there seems to be an increase in the like a return to nature and a desire to go hiking or desire to see green spaces and trees and forests
There's a
and
shift in mentality.
exactly. And so that's an experiential travel as opposed to a consumption travel, going to a city
Yeah.
to go shopping.
Right.
And so that has a potential to hit luxury, but it also has a potential to for luxury. And so there are experiential is what luxury does best. Like experience is important. I think it's quite telling that last year's Chinese New Year adverts from a lot of the big luxury brands involved shots of like plains or forests or green hills and grasslands and things like that. There was quite a lot of nature put into that. So I think that might impact the way that offline shopping is done. But we'll see. We'll see. I might just be reading much too much into it. But we'll see when it comes back to it. I think one of the big trends that I'm genuinely quite fascinated by and quite excited by long term is the growth of local brands in China. So I think what I'm really interested in is when we see the first truly global luxury brand from China. So we've seen, and by truly global, like I mean a brand that lots of people consume globally, but no one thinks of as a Chinese brand. They just think of it as a brand that is perhaps headquartered in China. The likes of, say, TikTok. TikTok's a good example of that. It's
Yeah.
like no one opens up TikTok thinking this is a Chinese company. If they think about it slightly further, they might, remember, oh yeah, it's headquartered in China, or it has Chinese origins. But no one specifically refers to it, oh, that Chinese social media platform. It's a global platform. Or maybe even the likes of, so in the fashion industry, in the fashion world, there's a fast fashion company called Shein. They do fast fashion, basically online fast fashion. Incredibly fast growing, amazing company for what they are. Probably hideously destructive to the environment in its own way. That's the industry, fast fashion. But that's a fascinating company as well, and it's the most kind of someone was explaining it to me the other day, and they were saying, well, if you're over 16, you haven't heard of it, but if you're under 16, you probably buy all your clothes from there.
Oh,
It's an amazing. They had more app downloads than Amazon recently in the US, so they're growing. And to be fair, like Amazon has probably saturated the market as far as app downloads go, but that's pretty fast growing company.
yeah.
Um, so I think a lot of brands are starting to see, a lot of Chinese brands are starting to see the success of these companies abroad.
Mm.
So they're starting to see their own brands appear, and become truly global brands. Much in the same way that like we think of LVMH. We don't think of LVMH necessarily as a French company, Louis
No.
Vuitton, like as a French name. But you don't think, oh, that French brand. You think of LVMH, the international brand. Louis Vuitton is an international brand.
Yeah.
Um, with origins in France. And so what I'm excited about seeing is that first Chinese company that is like a truly international luxury brand that just has origins in China. And so, there have been a few big Chinese luxury brands, like Shangsha, even what are they? There was I'm blanking. There's a few like over the past few years that have
Yeah.
popped up, done all right, but they haven't really kind of shaken the idea of being a Chinese company.
Mm.
Um, they've always been, yeah, they've always been kind of, they've always been that Chinese brand rather than a global brand that happens to be headquartered in China.
I
Bosidon,
see.
that was the one that I was thinking of. Bosidon, like
Oh,
interesting shop. They had a shop here in London, really amazing location of a shop on Bond Street, but never really shook that moniker, that label of being a Chinese brand. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when that happens, because it's going to happen soon. Undoubtedly, it will happen soon with the growth of Chinese companies. And so I think luxury brands, global luxury brands, will need to compete soon with
mm.
local brands, and more in market, but possibly globally soon as well. And I don't know how many of them realize that and are ready for that.
Hmm. Well, that's really interesting. You mentioned how Chinese brands can influence the world. Usually in the past, it's the other way around. So, it just kind of reminds me of another question, because luxury tends to be associated with emotional branding, identity. And now we are seeing, this, growing trend of Chinese nationalism, and their cultural identity is gradually built up. How do you see this trend of, self-identity instill into their branding and further influence the world? What will be the competition in due course between the Western counterparts like the one you mentioned, LVMH or Kering,
Mm.
versus Chinese brands which are culturally associated?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there's a specific issue with relevance and relevance to consumers, and
Hmm.
so yeah, a brand does need to have relevance to a consumer in order to provide something of value to them,
Right.
um, and that something of value can be, anything from beautiful design or intricate craftsmanship or a simply kind of a treasured object, right
Hmm.
through to other kind of forms of perceived value, but it needs to have that relevance. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, increasingly there will be more difficulty for global brands to provide that relevance to a consumer, but that's always been the case. So
Hmm.
the number of the number of clients that I've spoken to over the years who have said really kind of basic things of just like, of course, the Chinese consumer will like our brand we're a historic brand. They like that stuff over there, which I mean is completely wrong. But this kind of understanding of, well, Chinese consumers will just love this brand if we go and open up a shop in Shanghai because we're an old British brand, and they love that. Which is going absolutely nowhere to creating any kind of relevance for a consumer to the brand. It seems bizarre. So I think there will be an issue there with relevancy, with relevance to, like, there will be a gulf in relevance, and that local brands will of course be more relevant to a consumer than a global brand. But then that happens globally. It happens in all markets,
everywhere.
And luxury brands do find a way to provide value, provide that additional value through something else, through maybe being a global brand, through that global identity is perhaps something that will need to be leaned stronger on. It'll be interesting to see, though. It will be interesting. I think when it comes to like the impact that it will have on design aesthetics, or even like messaging aesthetics, that'll be really interesting. So in one of the sustainability is of course one of the big like driving trends throughout a lot of the fashion industry, and a lot of the luxury industry is all about sustainability, which is great to see. Some of it's a bit more kind of greenwashing, so it's a bit more like nice ideas and nice talking, but actually not enough action. But a lot of it is at least well placed and well meaning and going in the right direction. How brands tend to message that sustainability is in a visual way is kind of fascinated me recently. So in the West and in Europe and in America, that kind of messaging gets done by, in say packaging, very plain packaging. So like a lot of white space, maybe even like plain cardboard, not printed on. Like very, very plain, very simple. A few years ago, all of the brands were taking all of the serifs off their font, so it was very, very clean lines, very smooth font. Brands have started bringing serifs back for other reasons, but it's still very, very pared down, very simple design. And it's quite a Scandinavian design style.
Minimal.
Like it's quite minimal, exactly. It's minimalistic, which in the West is a symbol for sustainability. Even though, to be perfectly honest, it's still going through the same manufacturing process. And actually the difference between printing a package with a lot of white space on versus printing a package with a lot of different colors on doesn't involve any difference, that much difference in resources and in involvement in like sustainable practices. However, it's a messaging, the subtle messaging that is being done there, and also doesn't really work in China. So like a luxury brand that has very plain packaging, I've had brands come to me and say, look, our packaging is getting a lot of negative feedback right now because it's not seen as luxury. And they say, but we really need our packaging to look like this because we're trying to be a sustainable brand. And so then turning around to them and explaining, well, what you're doing there is this visual identity is sustainability based on this kind of Scandinavian design aesthetic, this very minimalistic design aesthetic, whereas that's of course not relevant in China. And so how does one ensure that brand value, the sustainability, is in some way messaged, but done so in a way that is relevant to the audience there? And yeah, of course, Chinese brands are going to be able to do that so much better because that's their home market. But Chinese brands will then experience the same issue coming up. They will have to adapt to different markets and adapt to what's required here. What's
vice
required
versa.
in other places. Which is it's I mean that's the game, isn't it? That's the challenge. That's what we do. And it's fascinating.
So sounds very interesting because it's absolutely crucial for companies to find a way to really penetrate the market they want to enter. Otherwise, they'll be stuck in their own identity building and never know what happens outside their comfort zone. Let's just zoom out even more. And because I knew you were, you were very fond of Asia, and of course you were raised, in the West too. Could you tell me, first of all, have you ever been to Taiwan?
I have not. I really want to go. I would love to go to Taiwan. It's been on my list of places to go for a while. Yeah, and so it's funny enough. So Taiwan, I two things that I kind of know of Taiwan, and I don't know much, but the two kind of main things I know of Taiwan that I want to go and see are weirdly enough the nature. I want to go like I want to see Taipei. I've heard a lot. I've got architecture friends who are obsessed with Taipei. So I would love to go and see Taipei and look around there. But I want to go countryside. I do want to go. I've heard wonderful things about outside of cities in Taiwan. I want to go hiking in Taiwan. Yeah, I've always wanted to. It seems very agreeable climate-wise. And so I would love to go explore hiking in Taiwan, which, A, there. And then B, funnily enough, the other thing that I know about Taiwan, and it's only from having Chinese colleagues, is a TV show, Kangsi来了, which it's hilarious. It's very, very, very funny.
Did you watch some episodes before?
Of course, yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the humor mostly I try and understand, and I have to say I think I enjoy watching people watching it more than I understand the jokes myself.
Oh, really?
But I do, yeah. Because I mean, I've had friends and colleagues just sitting there trying to get through an episode and just crying with laughter, just in absolute fits of laughter. An absolute phenomenon. What a show! And so. Yeah, those are my two touch points, cultural touch points in Taiwan. And so I would love to go hiking in the hills of Taiwan.
Yeah. Well, in Taiwan, many people say you could easily do, for example, you can work from 9 to 5, and right after work, if it's still early, you can really go hiking by simply taxi. You don't have to really travel further, to a neighboring city. You simply hike in Taipei.
Yeah, the convenience of that just
indeed. Yeah,
it does seem lovely. It does seem truly wonderful. And having spent the last year and a half in an apartment in London, and though we've got our green spaces, it's not the same. I want to go. I want to go wild again. I want to go experience some wild. And so the idea of going for a hike through Taipei and hike through Taiwan, and then of course eating.
Yeah, and you are aware of Chinese culture, and we share a lot of similarities when it comes to language. So I see no problem when you come eventually here.
Yeah, the food, of course, that will I think I'll be fine. I think I'll be able to get by.
Just picture yourself, if you've got a chance to teleport, what will be your first thing to do in Taipei?
Whenever I visit a city, the first thing I like to do is just go for a wander around the streets, around my hotel, stroll around, situate myself, find where I am, and eat something. I'm a big fan of eating. I do like food. So I imagine I would go and find, and one thing that I do miss about Asia in general is kind of convenience store food. I really do love going in and getting food from like little shops in and around the place. And so I think that would be it. That would be number one, would be find a little neighborhood restaurant, sit down and eat something. Yeah. And then start thinking, I'm a big fan of tourist sites still. Like I think everyone always says, oh, when you travel, you need to go off the beaten track and you need to discover the hidden gems. True, but I also do I think it's important to go see why you know, if there's a big famous tourist site.
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Why not? You got to go and see that. So I'd probably do that. I'd probably go to the museums and do all the cultural landmarks and things.
Yeah.
But I think number one spot, number one thing would be go and get some food.
Don't feel guilty to mention it. You know, I'm also one of you.
Yeah, food is important.
Right. Tom today shares some of the most insightful knowledge really about China market, and he talks about how he encounters those cross-cultural situations in a vivid manner. So Tom, thank you very much for your sharing today.
No problem. It was very nice. It was a very nice chat. I enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun.
Likewise here. Thank you very much. 喜欢本集访谈的内容吗？如果你是用 Apple Podcasts 收听，欢迎你为 Excuse 英国腔评价与留言，你的鼓励是我最大的动力。也欢迎你加入 Excuse 英国腔在脸书的社团，你可以直接与其他对跨文化沟通或喜欢英国的听众互动，还有机会与受访者直接的交流哦。如果你想实际支持我继续制作更多来自全球多元的访谈，也欢迎到本期介绍下的连结，请我喝杯珍奶吧。感谢收听与支持。如果你喜欢这一系列的双语访谈，并想增强英文能力，也欢迎到脸书或 IG 私讯我哦。Cheers, mate! Until next time, bye for now.